So the next activity that we're going to kind of talk about is actually not quite an activity, but a lead into an activity. And it's the concept that context is everything, right? So you want to explain that a little bit? Context.
So we're talking about everything that you grow up with is going to define how you approach the world, right? Like in the previous activity, we looked at our values and how those are different for different people. Our experiences are different, and that's the context. So how I see the world is going to be different based on what I've grown up with, what I've been exposed to, and where I'm at now.
Yeah. And what we know is that context is constantly changing. And so we have to adapt to the context or we suffer the fate of that dinosaur, right? And so when so that's why we use the dinosaur in this slide to actually represent the fact that if we don't adapt to the context, then we have a fate. And so we don't literally die, but our ideas, we lose innovation, we lose return on investment when we're not adapting to the context, right? So.
And we'd see that in a real life example, right? People who haven't adapted to technology. Technology is changing all the time, and we find it a little difficult to learn the new tools and resources. But if we don't keep up, then we lose out on a lot of the interfacing.
Yeah. And even it impacts our relationships, right? So I have social media, not because I'm a social media junkie, but because that's how I connect with family and friends over distances, right? So I'm learning to adapt, and we also have to recognize that there is probably a limit to our ability to adapt to context as it changes, right? So that's the setup. So thinking about context as everything, that our paradigm comes out of our context or is responding to our context. That context is about time, it's about space, it's about geography. And so when we think about context, that becomes the one of the deciding factors around how we interact with one another. And so this next piece hinges on a clear understanding of this idea of context. And so the next piece is this: what did I learn growing up card or matrix or checklist, if you will. And so there'll be particular ways that we want people to interact with this card. Before we actually get to talking about that, it is important to note that this activity is not about assessing fault, blaming people, or shaming people for what they know or don't know.
And we don't want to force them to share information they're not comfortable sharing. It's more of an exercise for them to see what their influences were growing up and to actually reflect on that. And then the conversation around it is more about what was surprising to them or where their context has led them and where they are at now.
Yeah. And to recognize that, again, whatever they know or don't know, or what their parents were able to give them, or family members were able to give them or not give them, we're not assessing blame or fault. It is about a fact-finding mission so that I can better make decisions about what I want to do with my own life and my goals. The other part is some folks will try to trip you up with, so what age range are you talking about, or what time period are you addressing? And how do you address that in a session?
I talk about any age, right? And when you're under the influence of adults when you are young. So I usually say between 0 to 18, typically when you leave home, is what I would consider childhood for this process.
Yeah. So I, when I use it in the same process, I just say you define it. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time defining things for people, because I know that I'm over 40 and I'm still not sure what I want to be when I grow up, right? Sure. So there is that. The other thing is that this activity can take as little as 5 minutes, but the real stretch or the growth area in this activity really lies in the reflection and the conversations that they have at the table. Right?
And we'll often find that people will sit and count the X's and O's, and we'll tell you what those are in a little bit. and that's not what the activity is about. It's about trying to see what your positives and negatives were and identify how you could work with them.
Yeah, so we've talked a lot about this activity. Let's just get to it, right? So, do you want to explain
Sure.
the process?
So with this process, what we're doing is it's a chart that you are asked to look at what your parents, for instance, the left-hand column will tell you what your parents, your friends, your influences with television talked about and addressed as you were growing up. And then on the y-axis, on the x-axis on the top, you'll see the column names are the African Americans, European Americans, so the different ethnic groups that may have been talked about. So if it was a positive conversation, say your parents talked positively about African Americans, you put a plus in there. If it was a negative conversation or negative messaging growing up, you put a minus. And any square can have a plus and a minus. It just depends which one's larger, because you could have mostly positive messaging and a little negative messaging, or vice versa. And if there was no conversation or very neutral messaging throughout, you just put it as a 0 in there.
Yeah, and recognize that these pluses, minuses, and zeros can take many shapes and forms in any combinations on the page, and that we purposefully did not add all the groups that we could have, because it is our hope that people can draw from this demonstration the lessons necessary to apply to other types of ethnicities and diversity. Mostly, we limited the number because the page only accommodated so many.
That's the honest truth.
That's
right
the
there.
honest truth, right? But if that comes up and people say, well, this group should be added or that group should be added, I can't deny that is a truth. And maybe if they would like, they can add those for themselves. But for the purpose of this conversation, we've selected these particular ones to help demonstrate a principle, which is that we don't know everything, right? And we're not to be blamed for everything at the same time, which will lead to the next piece. So when folks get into small groups to talk about this, what have you found has been helpful to spur the conversation or to keep the conversation focused?
I think before we break them out is just to say, hey, when you go back into your small groups, this is not to discuss the number of pluses and minuses. It's to discuss what you felt your messages were growing up and how that has impacted you where you are at right now. And after the initial hiccup with starting anything new, people dive in and they don't want to stop talking about this, because each of our experiences is so different. And to say, okay, I got negative messaging from television, but my family was positive, so this is where it left me.
Yeah. The other thing is to also judge where or try to read the group, right? And so if you're in a spot where you notice that after about, so first of all, before you break them out into their groups, tell them that you're going to give them 5 minutes to discuss. And I usually give 5 minutes when I have groups that are 4 or smaller, right? So that's usually 1 minute per person. And if you're doing a calculation, look at your group and see. So if you have groups of 5, you may want to say, 6 minutes or whatnot. But I typically give 1 minute per person to speak, and I also encourage them to do that. I'm also, as they're talking, I'm also reading the room to see if I need to cut this activity short and move on to the next, or if I can actually give them more time, because the discussion is where the real growth edges occur. And so looking for body language, are people leaning in? Are people on their devices? Have they gotten their phones out? Are they making eye contact with one another? Or have they all kind of isolated themselves to their particular chair or bubble, right?
And it may also require to walk around, listen to the conversation, and then jump in to get something going in the direction you want it headed. Because sometimes people, again, being at the superficial level of, this is what I marked, this is what you marked, and that's not what this conversation is about. So you might have to jump in to say, what did you learn from this exercise, and how does this now impact you going forward? Has your context changed from when you were a child in your definition versus where you are now?
Yeah. And again, and then once you bring the whole group back together, it isn't about trying to measure how many pluses or how many minuses people have. Back to your point, it really is about what did you learn? Where are gaps? Yeah. And typically, I allow people to walk away with this as a homework assignment, right? And so, where you have zeros, are there things that you are willing to, or need to do to change those zeros into a plus? And are there minuses that you have that no longer serve you, right? And so, from our personal experience, from what we've grown up with, and how do we manage all of those learnings, making sure that we're always goal driven.
And please give people a marginal amount of time there with that conversation, and allow for a little more if needed, because people come up with aha moments that they want to share with the group. So we typically ask for at least 3 people to share, and sometimes it takes a little bit of time for them to be comfortable doing it. But once they do, a lot of people want to share what they've learned from this process. So make sure you have that time marked out in your session.
Cool. So with this activity, we'll stop.